Well, welcome to Dreamforce. Thank you for coming to Lightning Communication Patterns. My name is Melissa Hansen. I'm going to get into things pretty quickly because I have a lot of ground to cover, but I did want to give a quick intro. I'm a Salesforce MVP, and I also co-lead the Portland Developer User Group. I serve on the Rad Women Steering Committee. If you're not familiar, Rad Women is a program that teaches advanced women admins on the platform how to code in a free 10-week course. So if you're interested in that, come talk to me after. And then I also have a day job. I'm a senior developer at a nonprofit called Stand for Children. We're a medium-sized national nonprofit with a really big vision and a really big reach. And so I get to build a lot of really cool stuff on the platform. And the latest thing that we built is a standalone, completely custom Lightning app that we host on communities that's public-facing. And so we built that last summer, like all summer. It was a very intensive push from our team to get out the door. And so we learned a lot about Lightning application and Lightning building really quickly. And one of the things that tripped us up the most, especially initially, was all of the communications that were flying around. I'm going to pull up the app in a moment, but when you're doing component-based development, you have a lot of different interconnected units, and they all need to be able to communicate with each other. And you're also in this big platform, and you have a server-side database. There's a lot of things that need to be able to communicate, and it can be difficult to get the timing right and to understand which kind of communications are going where. So this session was basically, how would I explain this to myself a year and a half ago? So hopefully you can get there a little bit faster. Apologies in advance, we're having an AV issue, so my PowerPoints are not super clear. Everything else looks fine, so you should be able to read the code when I pull it up. So just bear with me. If you're in the back, you may want to move up closer just so that you can see the slides because the resolution is wonky. So I'm going to hop into this app and tell you a little bit about it. Okay, so this is the Middle School Kindness Challenge. We distribute kindness-based curriculum materials to middle schools across the country. Schools sign up, teachers come in and register, and get access to these materials that they get to come in and interact with. So right off the bat, you can see that it's a very Lightning-looking app. So it's a custom app, but we use the Salesforce Lightning design system to get this nice look and feel. And that was really helpful for us because we're a really small team. We don't have a UI designer. And this enabled us to build something that looked really good, and we built it really quickly. So if you're going down that road, definitely go to some sessions on the SLDS. It's really awesome. So let's hop back into PowerPoint land. OK. So architecture review. If you're newer to Lightning development, I think it's helpful to just touch base pretty quickly on what the architecture looks like. So Lightning development, you've probably seen something that looks similar to this. It's a nice way to conceptualize, especially if you're coming from more of a model view controller. We still have our model view controller. We still have our model in the database. We've got our markup as the view, but we've got two controllers. We've got our client side and our server side controller. And one of the challenges is learning where to put the logic. We want to build snappy, responsive apps that are fun to use and get the data out to the user really quickly, which means you want to be making as few calls into that back-end database as possible. So the client-side controller, the JavaScript controller, it's not just handling view state, DOM stuff, user interactions. There's a fair amount of business logic that you'll be baking into there. And these are all things that need to be able to communicate with each other. Lightning development is component-based development. So components you can think of as reusable, self-contained, encapsulated units. And it's a great way to build big systems because you have the ability to build something once and use it all over the place. You can build, so I've got a little sample here of like if you had to build an expense calculator app for your staff, and you were building it in particular for this custom app, but that's kind of a handy thing. It's probably something that would be useful elsewhere. So I'm going to build it with an eye towards being able to just drop it into the Lightning experience or into communities. I don't need to rebuild it. I don't need to go in and do a bunch of work. I can just build something once. When you saw the app demo that I just pulled up, there were a lot of progress bars and little buttons and countdowns. It's generally the same component that's just being used over and over and over again because we don't want to have a special component for each and everything. So it's a really fast way to build. So what is a component bundle? It's sometimes good to point out. It's just a bundle of files that are going to contain the UI elements with your markup and your styling. You're going to have some controller files, so there's a controller and a helper that can both, that can both handle that logic. And then you're going to have some extra files too. You can document your component, which you should absolutely do. You have the option to plug into the rendering cycle, so you can do some custom rendering. And you can create a custom icon for your users. But in general, your bread and butter, where you're going to be working, is those 4 kind of files. Okay, so communication, that's our high-level architecture. I love this quote. It's talking about human communication, but the same thing applies with technology, because you spend a lot of time going, did it communicate? Like, it didn't work, but there are 10 things that could have broken. So trying to figure out if the communication, from the sender got to the receiver is kind of a struggle. And why is it a struggle? We have a lot of different things that are issuing and receiving communications. Oh, more PowerPoint weirdness. There should be a box around there. So these are the things we're talking about. We've got a user interface. We've got generally some kind of hierarchy. So we've got a parent component or app, and it's going to have child components that have a sibling relationship. We've got the Lightning Data Service, which is a part of Lightning where you can basically get single record data and do CRUD operations without having to build your own controller. So I'll talk a little bit more about that, but essentially it's getting data out of the server side. And then the Salesforce server when you do your own calls into the back end. So that's not too many things, but when you draw out in the simplest way what all the communications are, there's a lot. That's a lot going on. So if something's not working and you don't have a good idea of which types of communications you're looking for, it can get out of hand pretty quickly. So what I'm going to do is just kind of break these down, and we'll just dive into each one. And the first thing I did is just kind of categorize these. So the different types of communication we have, inter and intra-app communication. So the stuff that you're building talking to itself, your components talking to each other, communicating back up to any kind of parent that they're encapsulated within. We've got user interface events. So when your user clicks a button, when they put in a date, when they take any kind of action, you're going to want to respond to that. Server-side communications, I just mentioned, you're going to have your own server-side controller that's going to handle those, and you're also going to have the Lightning Data Service. And then system events. So this is the Aura framework and the Lightning framework are going to have some communications that you need to be able to listen and respond to. So those are our high-level categories. And we'll start with inter and intra-app communication, because that's kind of the biggest chunk of what you actually have to build. When we're going to talk about this, the main thing you need to think about is directionality. Am I communicating from a parent component into child components that are inside of it so that it's aware of those child components? Or am I trying to communicate back out? With event-driven development, it's a publish-subscribe model. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. But in general, the unit that's pushing out the communication doesn't know and doesn't care about anything listening for that communication. So that's kind of why the directionality matters here. So if we're talking about down the hierarchy, we've got a parent component or app, and then we've got child component apps. So how is that parent going to get data information back down? The number one way is by setting attribute values directly. So these are just variables within each component, and a parent component can set that directly. It has that child encapsulated within it, and it can say, here's your value. And it's direct, it's simple, it's pretty easy to understand. But we also have methods. So in your components, you can define a method, and that method is going to be something where you can pass in maybe a little bit more structured data. You can pass in multiple variables as opposed to an attribute where it's kind of one at a time. And you can also return a response back out, which is really nice. It'll be asynchronous, and you can't necessarily depend on that happening at a particular moment, but it's nice to have that option. So it's a little bit more fully featured. Finally, the parent component can broadcast out app events that its children will listen to. So I'll break down events a little bit more, but there's 2 main kinds, and the app events are events that get broadcast across the whole system. So if a parent component sends out an app event, that is something the child can subscribe to. It's not one of the main patterns. The main 2 you're going to be looking at are setting attributes and calling methods, but good to know. So other direction, up the hierarchy. So if you've got a child component, there's a good chance that it needs to broadcast information back out, like that date picker I demoed in the beginning. that's a pretty nested component, but there was a whole bunch of stuff up the stack that needed to respond to that. So if you need to communicate up the hierarchy, you have a couple options. The main one is to fire a component event. So I just mentioned application events. Component event is a little bit different. It is a specific type of event that components can fire that only their parents and antecedents can subscribe to. So you can fire it up the chain. Generally, you're looking to just send it to the parent, but you can also broadcast it all the way up. Parent components can't send that back down. Sibling components can't hear it. It's just a one-way up the hierarchy. Child components can also fire app events. So again, those system-wide broadcasts, if a child broadcasts one of those out, the parent component can pick it up. So I'm going to kind of break down a little bit further those two methods I just talked about. The first one being setting attributes. So I talked about it. It's pretty simple. The parent component dictates the value of the child. And there's two sort of flavors for that. There's bound attributes and unbound attributes. And it's a very simple change in syntax. But what it means is that if you have a bound attribute, those two values from the parent to the child are tightly coupled. If you change the value in the parent, it's going to be immediately updated in the child, and vice versa. Child goes right back to the parent. And the syntax there is you're going to use a bang. I don't know if this is legible at all because of the resolution, but essentially you've got, this is the parent component markup, and it's defining the child, and it's just setting that value to be whatever is in the parent. And I'm going to pull up some code. It might be easier to read. For unbound attributes, the parent is going to set that value once, and then it's done. So it's not going to worry about the state of the child. If the child changes the value of that attribute, it does not affect the parent. If the parent subsequently changes its value, child's not going to update it. When you're trying to figure out which one of these you need to use, what you want to think about is how do I need that value to be kept bound? Because bound attributes are more expensive from a system perspective. The system is trying to keep those things up to date. It's another set of communications that have to be running. So if you need those to be tightly coupled, great. But if you don't, if it's something that's really just going to get set once at the outset, then you don't want to do that because it's going to slow your app down. Next, I want to talk about methods. So calling method, you can kind of think of methods as defining an API for your components. This is where you're telling all the other components in your structure, this is how you can interact with me. Here are the types of things you can make me do. And, ooh, that markup is rough. So in this component, we've got an Aura method defined here. We give it a name. You can pack in attributes. And then you're going to have a function where you can basically call up that method, unpack those arguments, and go on with your day. So that's methods. So events, event-driven development. I alluded to this earlier. It's a publish, subscribe, fire, and forget model. Whichever entity you have that's broadcasting out is not aware of or concerned with anything downstream that is listening. So it has an event registered, broadcasts it out, and then it's done. It's not waiting on any kind of response. For other components to be able to pick that up and actually handle that event, they need to have handlers. So our firing event is registered over here, and then we have components B and C, both of which have a handler that's listening for that particular event. And so when that gets broadcast, they can pick it up. They've got a method defined that's going to go handle it and do whatever it needs to do. Component D doesn't have a handler for that event. It's still being broadcast out to it, but it doesn't have anything to pick it up. So basically, nothing happens. And then just to try, I think I've mentioned this a couple times, but the directionality of these component events versus application events. So component event is just going one way up the chain. And I mentioned before that antecedents beyond the parent, so grandparent, great-grandparent, can also pick that up. There's just some extra notation that you need to include. So it's an extra little thing here called include facets, and that will allow a child component to broadcast way up the chain. Application events can be fired by any component, and they're going to go everywhere. Every single component inside of your application is going to be able to pick those up. That also means that this is way more expensive than this. So if you find yourself using a lot of application events, you should probably be thinking about, is this the right pattern? Do I really need every single component in my app to know every single time this thing happens? Sometimes you do. But in general, you should be thinking about component events for that up the hierarchy, and then if you're going down the hierarchy, there are different ways to achieve that. So be judicious in your use of component events versus application events is the takeaway there. Event syntax. So syntax and the steps to create events. We've got 4 things that you need to do. First off, you actually have to create the event. So this is another Lightning entity that you need to generate. When you create the event, this is where you decide if it's a component event or it's an application event. And then you're going to define some attributes. What's the payload? What information do I need to pack into this event so that it can be heard? Sometimes you won't need one. Sometimes you just need to know a thing happened. But in general, you're going to be bouncing information around. So in the source component, what you need to do is register the event and fire the event. And that's just going to happen in markup. You're going to say, this is the event I want to use. I'm going to give it a name, a local name. And I'm going to describe what type it is. And then somewhere in my controller is where I'm going to fire it. And it's pretty simple. It's just a .fire, and then it's being sent out into the world. Your destination component has to have a particular handler for that event. And this is important, as you can see. The event name must be the same. So even though this is like a local name that you're giving within the component, the destination component has to use that exact same name, or it's not going to pick it up. And that might save you some time right there because, oh boy. You're like, I know it's got a registration in there. I know the other one has a handler. Why isn't this getting through? First stop, check and make sure the name is exactly the same. You haven't made a typo, and keep that consistent. The syntax for application events and the steps are very, very similar. Same thing, you want to create the event. The source needs to register the event. You can name it. The name here doesn't matter so much. So for component events, that local name really matters. For application events, not so much. Firing the event is very similar. You can see this syntax is a little different. So with the component event, we were just pulling that child component out of the markup. Here we've got this $a.get. And that kind of is a clue that this is more of a deep platform event that you're pulling up, because that's an aura notation. So that's where it's getting the app event, it's firing it, and then whichever components need to be able to handle it are going to have that handler. OK, so that is our inter and intra-app communication. And let me just get my phone out, because I don't think my timer is running. And will you give me a warning when I'm getting close? OK, thank you. UI events. So these, at least from a timing standpoint, are a lot easier to get, because these are in response to an action that your user is taking. Somebody clicked a button, somebody's setting a date. You're not so much worried about, is this happening in the init cycle? Is this happening somewhere else in the cycle? You know when these are going to be happening. And they generally come with things bundled in. So if you're using like base Lightning components, which you should be, they're going to come with handlers. So this Lightning button right here has this on-click. So that's essentially an event that is already defined for you as part of this Lightning component. And then you just need to define a function that's going to do something when somebody clicks the button. You can imagine that if you have a page that has a whole bunch of buttons or a whole bunch of interactions that are similar, but they're all options, you're not going to want to have functions for each and every one of those. So just know that you can unpack that event that's coming in to understand where that event came from. So in this example, we've got a couple different buttons, button A, button B. In our markup, we've defined both of them, but they're calling the same function. They're both calling handle click. And then when you look in the handle click function, you can see this event.getSource.getLocalID. That's going to tell you which button somebody clicked, so you can handle that logic appropriately. You don't have to have a separate one for each interaction. You can bundle those together, unpack the event that came in, and then go from there. Server-side events. So I'm including Lightning Data Service as a server-side call, because under the hood it is. But Lightning Data Service essentially allows you to do CRUD without controllers. So you can create, read, update, and delete individual records without having to define your own server-side controller, which is really nice. Like it's all baked in. It's some very simple markup. In some cases, you don't even need a client-side controller to handle that. So if you are building something that's just going to be using a single record, you should definitely be thinking about using the Lightning Data Service. But it is important to be aware that it is still a server-side call. You're still incurring some cost, some time there in order to make that call. And then here's a little bit of the markup. So very simple, force record data. We give it a record ID. There's some other information we want to define. But what I want to point out is this record updated. So this is an event. This is the Lightning Data Service saying, hey, when the record's updated, do you want me to do anything? So you can hook into this and say, yes, when the record is updated or deleted or loaded, I want you to call this function, and then I can figure out what I need to do. If somebody changed that record while somebody's using my app, I want to make another update, or I want to reload it, or I want to do something. So you need to be thinking about what those events might be and how you want to handle them. And then finally, on the server side, we've got asynchronous calls into Apex. So when you're building a component, you're going to have a server-side controller if you need to get data back out of the database. You're going to define that controller within your component or within your app. And that Apex controller needs to be a few things. It needs to have an @Aura-enabled notation on it. That's another one where you'll be like, why isn't this working? Oh, I just didn't put the Aura-enabled on. It needs to be static, which makes sense because these are asynchronous calls. This isn't a back and forth communication. They need to be public or global just to be available. And then this isn't a requirement, but I would suggest if you've got your client-side method and it's calling your server-side method, name them different things. Something that's going to tell you which one. Because when you're going through the debugging, tree or cloud or whatever it looks like, and you're trying to figure out what's breaking, if you're using the same name for both, it's easy to go down the wrong rabbit hole. Passing data types and casting. Again, you want to be thinking about how can I make this call to the server as lightweight and concise and quick as possible. So if I have a whole list of S objects, that could be a really big payload. But maybe I only need a couple of things off those S objects. So what you want to think about doing is, can I maybe just cast that into a JSON object? This is going back to JavaScript, so it's going to be really easy for it to read through that. And now I can just pick and choose the data that I want to pass from the front end to the back end, and that can really speed things up really significantly. And you're also not going to run into issues with Apex not being able to quite understand the object type that JavaScript passed in. We've got a highly typed language and a loosely typed language, and so there can be some collisions there when JavaScript is trying to pass in something and Apex is like, I don't know what that is. So using JSON is generally a good way to go. Finally, system events. So this is where you're going to find out from the Aura framework and from the Lightning framework what's happening. There's quite a few of these system events. The main ones that you're going to be reacting to are, I've got here up on the screen. So init is probably the biggest one. Init is what gets fired when your component has been initialized and is ready for you to do anything you need to do before it gets rendered. So a lot of times this is where you'll be doing your quick little bit of logic of, okay, if it was the middle school kindness challenge, which phase are we in? Okay, we're in this phase. This is the component I need to display. There's going to be a lot of logic there just on that initial cycle. Render, if you want to do some fancy rendering somewhere in that cycle, you can plug into render and after render so that you can handle those. System error, if something's gone wrong, it's good to know about that. So the order in which things initialize, this is important. You're going to have a hierarchy. You're going to have grandparent, parent, child, and in this case, all the way down to a lightning button, which is its own component. And if you were to guess which thing initializes first, you might guess that the parent app would go first, and then its child and its grandchild. And you would be wrong, because it initializes in this order, from the inside out. If you load this page, the very first thing that's going to initialize is going to be that lightning button, and then the grandchild, and then the child, and then the parent. It's like, okay, well, that's no big deal now that I know. But the thing is, a lot of times you've got a parent component or a parent app, and when it initializes, you want to do a whole bunch of logic and figure out where you are and what your app needs to do, and then pass information down the hierarchy. But if you're trying to do that on init, the whole hierarchy is already built. So you're not going to be able to do that logic in the init cycle and pass it down. You need to be thinking about a different way to do that. And this one, I'm also going to do a demo on because I think it sort of helps crystallize. Let's go back over here. And yep, init demo. So in this case, I'm also going to open up our console. going to clear that out. And I put in some debug statements just so that you can kind of follow what's happening. And then I'm going to reload this. So we've got our parent component, we've got a child component, same sort of pattern where it's printing out a value for the parent and for the child. I'm just going to refresh this so that we can get a fresh console log over here. And you can see, let me see if I can make that, if I can bigify. So the very first thing that happens is that the child component controller doInit is entered. And it's looking to see, do I have a value from my parent's init cycle? Nope. And then the child component init finishes. Then the parent component controller does its init, enters it, sets a value, and leaves. So the parent has the value, the child doesn't. If we look at that code, you can see, okay, here's my parent attribute. I haven't set a default value, so it's not being set there. So the only place it can be set is in this init. And when we take a look at the init, here we go. We've got component.set. And this is where it's setting the value. Down here on our child, we've got, this is where we've got our child attribute, no default value. It has its own doInit cycle, which I don't have. And this is where it's printing that out to the debug log of like, hey, do I have this value? Nope, no, I don't. So very important to get that timing right and to know when you're going to be setting and passing data. OK. Boop, boop, boop. OK, so those were our big blocks. We've got our user interface events. We've got a parent component and child components. We've got our Lightning data service. And we've got our Salesforce server. So if we take these one at a time, I think it helps to clarify. So we've got our onClick, our onBlur, our onKeyUp. Those are the events that are going to be passing in from the user interface to the parent and to the children. We've got our parent component, and when it needs to communicate down to its child components, in general, it's going to be doing that via attribute setting and via component methods. Child component needs to communicate. It's going to be using either component events just to go up the hierarchy or app events to go system-wide. And then child component, Lightning data service, so when we have a component that needs to either reload a record or record updated, it's going to be calling into the Lightning data service, and that data will come back around. And then, of course, we've got our Salesforce server calls, so we're going to have asynchronous callbacks from our components back into the server. And hopefully that has sort of clarified the different categories of events, given you some ideas of which things you need to be looking at, called out a few pitfalls. Oh, before I just go forward one more time, I'm going to go back to this demo because I like to call this out as kind of a tips and tricks type thing. So these printouts here to the debug log, especially if you're just building, I mean, you don't need to keep these when you're going to production, but I would highly recommend putting these console logs and packing in the name of the class, the name of the method, and entered and exit, and have basically the entered at the top of each method and the exit at the bottom. Because when you're using that console log, which you'll be doing a lot, you have a really clear idea of where you are in your app, and it's much quicker to see which thing is going wrong. Sorry, I forgot to call that out earlier, and that kind of saved my butt a few times. So it's nice to share. And with that, I've just got a few suggested sessions that you may want to check out this week if you're interested in more Lightning development events. And I have no idea if there's time for questions. 5 minutes. Great. Perfect. If anybody has any questions, I can take them, or we can wrap up. Brazel.
Use this. Mm-hmm. So, like on the community's self-register page, there's a custom field set. Mm-hmm. So you're using, I think, probably a Apex controller to get the custom field set. But then you want to populate one of those particular fields, and you might need to use another Apex controller to get that populated, like let's say country. We have our own, custom country list. Mm-hmm. So how does timing work for something like that? Are there events like right now I'm setting an attribute for the country population, mm-hmm. but is there an event for that, like for when it gets filled that I can? So
are you calling into like a standard controller for that?
Yes.
Okay. I'm not sure. So we did something similar when we did our registration process for communities, but what we ended up doing, because I was hitting some issues similar and kind of adjacent to that, is we built our own custom one. I used that standard one as a little bit of a model, but I think it can be simpler. It's not a super complex set of data in that controller, and so I think building just one whole custom so that you can handle all of that together might be a little bit smoother.
Yeah,
I think I started to go down the road you did, and then I stopped.
Yeah, the field set is a nice option just because you think somebody else might be able to use it, but maybe I'm making it a little bit more complicated. Is that, yeah?
No, the field sets make sense. I haven't used those much.
Yeah,
yeah.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Anybody else? Okay, fantastic. If you want to chat more after, I'll be hanging around. Thank you.